Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. Remember, we're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. And today we are going to discuss the Battle of Fredericksburg on the 160th anniversary. And joining me to discuss this are very good friends, historians, and residents of Fredericksburg. The Unfiltered Historian, Tyler McGraw. Welcome, Tyler.
Thank you for having me, Des.
And good friend, Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Des, for having me.
Okay, let's start where we left off the Antietam podcast, and that was with the sacking of George B. McClellan and the appointment of Ambrose Burnside. And Tyler, I'm going to get you to start with this one, please.
Yeah, not a problem. So right after Antietam, you're going to have this very contentious, I would say very prolific even, issue with Lincoln and McClellan. McClellan does not pursue Lee as he should in the eyes of the government. McClellan's going to position himself right outside of Warrenton, Virginia, and kind of wait. The weather is starting to change too, so that's really going to play into why McClellan's really not moving too much, because a winter campaign isn't necessarily the most ideal operation when it comes to the United States military and or the Confederate Army. But Lincoln has sort of a plan up his sleeve, and Lincoln's wanting to issue what we would call the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In order for this document to have any type of strength and maybe even just holding up, he's going to need a military victory in the South, which he hasn't quite secured yet, in order to release this document. Now, of course, the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is going to be freeing slaves in those states that are in rebellion. Those states that are in rebellion consider themselves no longer a part of the Confederate or the United States, excuse me. So you're going to have Lincoln needing to get a military victory. However, with McClellan's current situation, sitting around Warrenton, kind of not doing anything, just being idle, it's going to be time to replace him. So Catharnius Buckingham will show up at the winter camps and bring with him the letter that would put Burnside into command of the army. McClellan and Burnside have a quick chat in their tent, and then we'll get caught up to speed as to what the situation is, and Burnside will start to set the wheels in motion to position his army on the banks of the Rappahannock River. Now, initially, Burnside is kind of thwarted by some of the politicos in Washington. One of those, and I call him a politico, of course, he is General-in-Chief of the Army at the time, if I'm not mistaken, it's Henry W. Halleck. Burnside has this idea to go into Fredericksburg using the RF&P Railroad and not the Orange and Alexandria Railroad that's favored by the president and favored by even Halleck. Aiding Burnside in this argument was going to be a man by the name of Herman Haupt, and Herman Haupt is the chief of the railroad with all the military strategies, and even he will agree with Burnside that the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, being only a single track, is not a viable option to get into Fredericksburg or to have a strike into the South. And the reason for that is because of numerous things, but one big one, we can just point it to John Mosby even. Mosby's Confederacy is running through the heart of where the Orange and Alexandria Railroad is, and he's tearing up track left and right. Versus the RF&P Railroad, Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, where the tracks are not only just limited to one, but you also have places to build these huge supply depots. Example of that would be Aquia Harbor. So with Haupt's help, Burnside and Herman Haupt will sway the president's mind to favor Burnside's strike into Fredericksburg. And on November 17th of 1862, elements of the Army of the Potomac will make their presence known on the banks of the Rappahannock River in what today would be Stafford County, Virginia.
Cool. Tim, do you want to add anything to that, mate?
No, I think Tyler pretty much hit the nail on the head. I mean, he mentioned Halleck, and one of the more interesting things that I find about that is just that relationship between Halleck and Burnside was pretty much poisoned from the start. And I don't know if Tyler was going to go into this later, but he basically sabotages Burnside because there's considerable evidence that he slow rolled getting the pontoon bridges down here. So
We will discuss that a little bit later, but yeah.
okay.
Okay, so as Tyler said, on the 17th of November, Darius Couch's Second Corps arrives on the banks of the Rappahannock River, overlooking Fredericksburg. At the time of arrival, less than 1,000 Confederates were in and around the Fredericksburg area, and there was no way to cross the river for the Union Army. But there were other attempts made at trying to get across this river. So one of those has something to do with Port Royal. So Tyler, I'll bring you in again to talk a little bit about that, please.
Absolutely. So when we're talking Fredericksburg, we're really talking a game of rivers, if you will. The river we're going to be speaking highly about is going to be the Rappahannock. Now, Fredericksburg isn't necessarily the only point to cross when you're trying to get to Richmond and using the Rappahannock River as kind of your jump off point. There's a few places when the river widens. The first and chief among those that we're going to be talking about is Port Royal. And further downriver, we have Tappahannock, Virginia. And I love that you have all those on the map there, too. That's just incredible to show kind of what we're talking about there and how spread out they really are, too. They're not necessarily on top of each other. They're rather spread out. But let's talk about Port Royal for a second. Port Royal is going to see one of the most interesting aspects, in my opinion, of the Battle of Fredericksburg. 3 Union gunships. It's the USS Jacob Bell, the USS Anacostia, and the USS Carrituck, if I'm not mistaken. I think those are the 3 that end up venturing to Port Royal. So these are big Union gunships that are actually navigating through the Rappahannock River. Of course, if you go to Fredericksburg today, it's kind of hard to imagine a Union gunboat sitting in there with all the sediment and rocks that have really come up from the river and now sit in that area. But when you go further downstream or downriver to Port Royal, you have a little bit of elbow room, if you will, and you can have these ships safely navigate up the river. Of course, Confederates are all over this at the time. So on the 17th, when Burnside arrives, obviously Confederate forces are aware of the presence, and Lee is going to start maneuvering his troops to fortify the city and the heights surrounding, to include Port Royal. Burnside's looking for other places to launch this strike against the South, and Port Royal is among them, which is why we have the Union gunboats going up the river. So when they finally arrive, they are surprised that Confederates and elements, I think it's PD's battery, or A.J. Hardaway, excuse me, Hardaway's battery, and a few other elements of Confederate artillery are going to be on the bluffs of the Port Royal area. And when the Union gunboats come on, there's this fierce artillery duel between the ships and the cannon on the heights. And there's going to be a few shells to actually strike and damage the ships, then they'll have to change course and move around. So even before the Battle of Fredericksburg takes place, there's a naval battle right along the Rappahannock River, not too far away from Fredericksburg. And I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about when we're talking about this battle where the river's so prominent. A little known fact is that there was a decent sized naval battle here on the Rappahannock River, and it is going to prove to Burnside that the Confederates are defending all the points down the river. So it's really going to make Fredericksburg even more of a crossing point, which is interesting because Tim brought up the pontoons, and Daz, if it's okay with you, I can start moving into the pontoons a little bit since we're talking about the river and what those are necessary for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously when Burnside arrives, there's a reason he's looking to cross at other places. He doesn't have a functioning bridge in place at that time on the 17th to cross forces over into Fredericksburg and fortify the town. The method to ratify this problem would be by constructing pontoon bridges that the Union engineers would later build. The problem is, and again, Tim hit this excellently, he mentioned that Halleck sort of sabotages him. And whether it's Halleck being spiteful that he kind of was showed up by Herman Haupt and Burnside in that meeting, and his plan gets scrapped, Burnside's gets favored. Who knows? There's plenty of things we can point at as to why this happens, but it's definitely interesting to look at that Halleck virtually takes the orders for the pontoon bridges, which are currently at that time in a place known as Berlin, Maryland. He's basically just kind of putting this order on the table and throwing other things on top of that intentionally and letting it just sort of sit. And this is progressively making it hard for Burnside because he can literally just watch Confederates every single day moving into Fredericksburg, fortifying the town, taking up positions along the river, you name it. So this is also kind of demoralizing for the Union Army to just sit and wait and watch across the river Confederates build up. You had an element of surprise on the 17th to an extent. You could have very well gotten across and established at least a depot or just a bridgehead, if you will. But of course, these bridges aren't in time. Halleck's really kind of the one to blame with that. And other members of the Union Army are going to suffer due to Halleck's incompetency with this. You're going to have a man by the name of Daniel Woodbury actually arrested by Burnside because Burnside deems that he's the one that's being negligent in this and not allowing the bridges to be brought to Fredericksburg. So formally under arrest. Obviously, that's dismissed later when it's really found out that Woodbury isn't the chief problem here getting the pontoons there. But that pontoon delay is going to very seriously hamper Burnside's plans later as we talk about the battle.
So, Tyler, could you tell us a little bit about the negotiations between the mayor of Fredericksburg and Burnside, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's initially when the Union forces are arriving on those banks of the Rappahannock and Stafford, there is some serious threat to the city of Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg's threatened to be shelled unless this town is surrendered. And Lee's obviously not surrendering the town immediately. So there's going to be a case to plead. And that case is going to be pled by none other than Fredericksburg's ironic mayor. His name is Montgomery Slaughter. Burnside's not going to directly deal with Slaughter at first. The person that's going to be in charge of dealing with this dispute or this bargaining, I like to call it a bargaining because it's basically just trading time at this point. But Slaughter is going to meet with a man by the name of Marcena Patrick, who is the provost marshal of the Union Army or the Army of the Potomac. And initially, he rejects Slaughter's offer to meet and discuss terms as to what can happen with Fredericksburg, just because he hasn't informed his superiors and he's not necessarily able to do so. So he's really following military protocol 2AT as provost and isn't going to meet with them. However, he gets the clearances and he is able to extend that, and a party accompanied by Montgomery Slaughter will move over to a place known as Chatham Manor, which, Darren, thanks for the picture too. That's the riverside of Chatham, actually. So on that same property in the manor house that's going to be in the other side of the picture there, we can't see it, obviously, because it's taken from the riverside. But they're going to meet there and they're going to discuss terms as to Fredericksburg. And the ultimate agreement that they're going to come up with is that Fredericksburg will not be shelled unless she fires first. So for the time being, Fredericksburg is safe from the growing number of Union artillery that is now being amassed on what is known as Stafford Heights. So Slaughter basically gives the town more time, which ultimately does lead to Confederates fortifying the town even further. But Lee does give some type of, I guess you could say, comfort to the Union Army by saying that the city of Fredericksburg will not be used for military operations, and adding some of the same verbiage unless Fredericksburg is taken or threatened.
Tim, would you like to talk about the Army of Northern Virginia's journey to Fredericksburg and where they are before the battle?
So yeah, at the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Army of Northern Virginia is still divided into its two wings. One wing led by Stonewall Jackson. That wing's located out in the Shenandoah Valley at the time. James Longstreet's got the other wing, and he's at Culpeper, preparing to obstruct or delay the prospective Union advance on Culpeper. However, when Burnside steals march, and he really does on Lee, basically Lee has to identify where Burnside's going. Burnside beats him to Fredericksburg, however, but due to the bridge mix-up, Lee's able to rush Jackson all the way from the valley, rush Longstreet over here. Longstreet takes up position in the city and behind the city on the heights, while Jackson fills in to Longstreet's right, extending the line down to Prospect Hill, and actually further out, almost to Port Royal, if that's correct, Tyler.
Yeah, no, they're down that far. Skinker's Neck, to be exact, is what it would be called.
So Lee doesn't really know where Burnside's going to actually try to cross. He's got a full wing basically opposing, any crossing in the Fredericksburg vicinity, while Jackson spread out to, at least delay any crossing further south. If that happens, then Lee can move Longstreet down, or that's his plan. In the event he doesn't need to do that, and he actually ends up needing to pull Jackson rapidly from positions much further south to anchor the line, basically from Longstreet's right, just south of Marie's Heights, Wills Hill, all the way down to Hamilton's Crossing on the RF&P, Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railway. So yeah, that's kind of what Lee has to do to obstruct Burnside's advance here at Fredericksburg.
Okay. So let's look at how the armies compare to each other, because there's quite a big difference in numbers. So the Union Army has, and they've been organised into grand divisions. So, Tim, could you just tell us about the grand divisions quickly, please?
So yeah, that was kind of a recent innovation of Burnside's. It's his major organizational change. So upon taking command of the army, he basically takes, so it's a somewhat confusing name because it is superior to a corps. But you have, so you basically have your regiments organized into brigades into divisions into corps, and then corps are combined into these grand divisions. So his 3 grand divisions will be commanded by Edwin Vo Sumner. Joseph Hooker will have the center grand division, and the left grand division is under William B. Franklin. So each of these will have 2 corps in the division, or in the grand division. So it basically allows for further, I guess, decentralization in a way, in the sense that these are, the corps are intended to be semi-autonomous mini armies, basically. So this makes them larger mini armies, basically, in essence. It allows Burnside to basically shift it down to relatively large forces commanded by these 3 men. Ironically, most of them dislike him, which is a source of discontent moving forward.
And if people are wondering why Franz Seagull is on there, and that is because there was a reserve grand division, which I found out the other day, and that's why I put him on there.
Yep.
But anyway, so the Confederates, they only had 2 corps, but Tim's already mentioned Longstreet and Jackson, but they only have about 78,000 men, but that's not going to matter because of the way they set themselves up. So how does Lee actually set his army up once he gets to Fredericksburg?
Yeah, so Lee has 78,000 men versus Burnside's 120. It's worth noting that this will be the largest number of troops engaged, in battle during the war. Total 230,000 men total. And that's somewhat debatable. Not all of them actually will engage, but Lee comes, and so he will occupy portions of Fredericksburg with a brigade of William Barksdale's Mississippians. They will be ordered to obstruct any crossing here at Fredericksburg. Jackson will have men posted further south at possible or potential crossing sites south of Fredericksburg. But Longstreet will take the left of the Confederate position, stretching from crossings just north of Fredericksburg down the heights that become known as Marie's Heights to just south of the town, where Jackson's wing will basically pick up. Once he becomes aware that this is going to be the crossing site, Jackson will move all his men up. They'll fill into Longstreet's right and extend the line down to an elevated piece of terrain overlooking the railroad known as Prospect Hill. That's also a very good artillery platform. And keep in mind, what you see today is far more wooded than what would have been there at the time. And Jackson's line will basically terminate at the railroad station known as Hamilton's Crossing. And from there, it's protecting the Confederate right flank will be Stuart's cavalry division, which will basically pick down what's known as the Bowling Green Road to prevent any Union force from swinging around the Confederate flank and coming in behind Lee. So that's his plan for the battle.
And both sides have a lot of artillery, don't they? So how do they actually set up their artillery? How do both sides set up their artillery?
So the Union are going to come to bear around 183 cannon thereabouts, and they're going to line that up along Stafford Heights and around some of the places in Fredericksburg once they get across. But the initial line of artillery that the Union implement are all on a very, very commanding piece of ground, just like the Confederates, actually. So not only do you have the Union Army on the heights opposite Fredericksburg, but the heights just behind Fredericksburg. So this is on the Fredericksburg side of the river, obviously. Confederates themselves are going to find some ample places to put their guns that are really going to be commanding in their own right. And I see two of the pictures here again. Perfect, Aaron. I love it. The one here on the right is on top of a place known as Telegraph Hill, later becoming Lee's command post, due to the fact that it is a excellent view, an extremely excellent view of Fredericksburg. You have almost the entire town here in your sights when you're on Lee's Hill. Today it looks a little different. As Tim mentioned, a lot of the areas today are much more wooded than they were in 1862. So the view isn't necessarily the same. Also factor in urban sprawl and development that has just completely demolished most of the Fredericksburg battlefield. She still has some examples, and Lee's Hill is one of the best ones. And all throughout that line on what today is Lee's Drive, going all the way down to Prospect Hill, you have Confederates that are going to be finding great places. Another one known as Howison Hill, which is just another excellent place to really, really drive in artillery to this battle, because they're going to be able to shoot in multiple different directions. There's a trajectory that is kind of coming to this point too. Howison Hill really being the middle of the artillery line on the Confederate side of things. And it's just, again, one of those commanding views that can send artillery down into the fronts. Being that there's two fronts, which we'll get into a little bit later, there's some more artillery put up on heights, just very similar to what you're seeing here. And even on Marie's Heights, for those that know the infamous story of the stone wall and the futile assaults going against the wall, there are lots of artillery to talk about there as well. And again, they're put on high ground. So high ground's really the thing with this battle in artillery. You want to find the best possible spot to put it. What better than commanding ground that overlooks the town on both sides?
Cool. Okay, let's move to the actual building of the pontoons. Obviously, we've mentioned Halleck stitching Burnside up and big time, but eventually they do get their pontoons and they've got to build them. So we'll start with the middle crossing. Tim, could you tell us a little bit about the the process of them building the pontoons and them getting across on the middle crossing, please?
Sure. So Burnside has several resources at his disposal. He basically needs to identify where he's going to try to cross, and he has 3 grand divisions. Makes sense. I'm not entirely sure it was for this reason, but he decides on 3 crossing sites. One basically at the northern edge of town, that's the upper crossing. The middle crossings near what's known as the city dock today, basically from Ferry Farm, which was the boyhood home of George Washington. They had to plug him for you, Daz.
There you go.
And then the lower crossing site, basically just below town in the city limits, crossing over to in vicinity of what's known as Mansfield, the Bernard plantation. To build these bridges, he has two different types of engineers in the Army of the Potomac. He has regular engineers. These are the official U.S. Army engineered troops, regular Army professional soldiers. Then he has volunteer troops. These will include the 50th New York engineers, who will arguably be probably the most prominent volunteer engineers over the course of the war. And they will primarily build, I believe, the lower crossing. So once the bridges finally arrive after Halleck's potential interference, even then Burnside, however, doesn't immediately start construction. They start the construction there on the night of the 11th or 10th into the 11th. It's a foggy morning. But as the fog lifts, the Confederates, in Fredericksburg and along the line, are able to observe and begin to obstruct and obstruct the construction of the bridges. And in town, particularly at the upper crossing site, this will be the Mississippians under Barksdale.
Talk a little bit about the upper crossing then, and obviously Barksdale's brigade contesting this, and which will lead to a couple of firsts, won't it?
So engineers being shot at, Burnside's got to try to deal with this. He decides to rely on the most visible tool he has, which is the artillery. So he directs Henry Hunt, the chief of artillery, to basically bombard the town. The result, however, are disappointing. It causes damage, but in a way it actually makes even more formidable defenses, because the Confederates are able to hide in the rubble. Most of them shelter in cellars during the bombardment. Frank O'Reilly, who wrote pretty much the book on the battle, in my opinion, says that his results were disappointing, even laughable. I mean, this isn't, it's just what they told him to fire in the town. He just fired in the town, but it didn't have the same effect. Charles Wainwright, O'Reilly writes, basically, who was the chief of the 1st Corps Artillery, observed a particular battery's fire. He watched solid shot pass through wooden buildings without effect. Brick and stone structures crumbled under fire, but the wooden structures absorbed the solid shot. Every time they poked a hole through a clapboard house, they made another firing portal for the rebels, so actually increased their defensive capabilities. So it was the first time, it was the most significant major bombardment of an American city up to that point. So once the bombardment was complete, the engineers attempted to recommence their work, but the same thing happened. So in a result, they reached out for volunteers and decided to use the pontoon boats, that lay underneath the bridge, to row a brigade at first across the river. You have the location there, Darren, thank you. And that monument is to the 1st regiment that completed this crossing, which was the 7th Michigan Volunteer Infantry of Norman Hall's 2nd Corps Brigade. So they row across at this location here, get up, and then commence basically the first. So that right there is the first riverine assault, really, in American military history. And then it's really what follows is really the first significant instance of street fighting as well in American history. So several firsts right there, as you mentioned, Des.
Yeah. And from what I understand, they were voluntold, not volunteered. Is that right? You're going across the river. Yeah, so let's talk about...
always have the honor.
Yeah.
That's basically what it was. Burnside needed somebody to do it. He knew the mission was going to be dastardly or suicidal, but they needed a bunch of eager volunteers, and the 7th Michigan seemed to be the ones. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Burnside actually gave him a second question, like, are you sure that you want to be the ones to go? And Norman Hall was aware of how important this situation was and how unique it would be to make it across the river. So I think that plays a lot into why they were voluntold, if you will. But it seems like a lot of the seven Michiganders were eager to go with Norman Hall. So voluntold, yeah, we can say that they're voluntold, but at the same time, I think there is that eagerness between the seventh Michiganders, and they really want to be that first regiment across. They're eager to do this. So I think that might also play into it.
If I remember correctly, Norman Hall was actually very enthusiastic, and his troops were equally enthusiastic. But at the middle crossing, which was also opposed by Barksdale's troops, I think those were under Andrew Govan's Confederates. They were a conglomeration of detachments from several Mississippi and a Florida unit. When they
Lang's Floridians, yeah.
Yep, when they continued to obstruct the 50 New York, the 50 New York engineers, Burnside then voluntold Colonel Lucius Fairchild was with the 89th New York to detach 4 officers and 100 men to basically do the same thing there at the middle crossing. So they crossed.
So that's where the voluntelling comes in.
Yep, they were voluntold. Whereas the troops in Hall's brigade, which was followed up by the rest of the brigade, to include several notable units, the 19th and 20th Mass, the Harvard Regiment. And that's actually, I think, the 20th Mass in the street fighting in there on Suffice Street, or Caroline Street. Caroline Street is the name of the painting, I think. And they, were the ones moving from alley to alley, house to house, rooting the Confederates out of the cellar. Not something you imagine Civil War soldiers with single-shot muskets undertaking.
I was going to bring that up because the street fighting side of it, again, like you said, it's the first time that urban warfare in American history. These guys are used to fighting a certain way on a battlefield. So this must have been alien to them, And so what was this street fighting like, guys?
It was awful. And Frank O'Reilly gives a wonderful tour of the Irish Brigade normally on the anniversaries. And when he gives his tour, he has this really interesting story that, I've just clung on to since I've heard him give the talk initially. And it's imagine there is just loud cacophony of battle. You're in the middle of artillery going off on one side. You have men shouting and screaming in combat. You have muskets going off. You have artillery going off on the Confederates. I believe there's some Confederates still also returning shots, or at least attempting to. But nonetheless, you just have the loud sounds of a battle. Now, with that in mind, when the Confederates see the Union come across and the Union establish that beachhead, specifically the 7th Michigan and the folks that are following behind, Confederates are in houses, they're in cellars, they're in backyards, they're in places that are normally hard to reach. And the Union Army is really deeming what the Confederates are doing as murder, not necessarily combat or honorable combat, if you will. So there's essentially a black flag order to take no prisoners. These men just murdered the engineers. These men that were shooting at you were not fighting honorably. They were fighting murderously. So now there's this confliction between the Union troops. Do I go in this house and do I kill every man I see? Or do I come out with prisoners? And that's followed and disobeyed. Some troops can't consciously go into a house and execute that personally. And mind you, bayonets are used in the Civil War. Yes. Hand-to-hand combat does happen. It is not as frequent as it's made out to be. So when you're faced with Fredericksburg, this really highlights the fact that it's not as common because you have troops that are not willing to go into the house and kill the man that they're literally face-to-face with. Some troops have that ability. And Frank writes there, talks about this incident in one of the houses along Sophia Street, literally almost right in front of the upper crossing, that over those sounds that I mentioned earlier, all the sounds of battle, you could hear screaming inside of one of these houses, and only Union troops are emerging. So that gives you a little taste of the ferocity on the fighting that's happening in the streets and in the houses of Fredericksburg. Men are following this black flag order or this take no prisoner order. Some men are not. Some men just simply can't really come to terms with trying to execute somebody at that close of a range. And again, this is the first time that urban combat's happening, so it's not expected for every man to follow that order, going into a house, killing the man right in front of you with a bayonet or the club of your musket or your bare hands. It's not something that's seen before, so these men are having to improvise and, again, either obey the order or disobey the order. So that's really how ferocious it was. And another really kind of a crazy incident is something known as the Blind Alley on Hawk Street. The Confederates are able to just rake fire upon these Union troops that don't necessarily know where it's coming from. They're in a position in this alleyway that it's not visible to them, the position the Confederates are currently holding. So when they're in this position, they're literally taking fire from almost all sides, and they're not able to properly return fire because they can't see the Confederates that are shooting at them. So just try to put yourself in the shoes of a Union soldier as you first make it into Fredericksburg. For weeks, you've been watching it from across that side of the river just grow with numbers of Confederates. Your men on the bridge were just, again, murdered. They're not killed in combat. This is considered murder by the Union Army. So there is some just differences in every other battle that we talk about in the war. Fredericksburg has its unique combat style, if you will. I mean, it's ferocious. The fighting here is something that isn't really seen again until you get to places like Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, and you're that close and personal again. Maybe, a few instances at Gettysburg, but nothing like Fredericksburg.
No. Wow. That's really cool. Not cool, but yeah.
I understand. No, I got you.
You know what I mean? Yeah, to hear that. Yeah. One thing I want to bring up, guys, is the lower crossing, because you never hear anything about that. So what actually happens down at the lower crossing? Are they harassed as they cross? What happens down there?
This is Tim's favorite area, so this is all him.
Which is behind your house, I believe, Tim, isn't it? Somewhere around there.
It is basically by my house.
Jealous.
To be honest, no, not the lower crossing is not. It's the last one established. The first two are established first, and then the lower crossing is assembled. By that point, there's just too much territory between there and where the Confederate line is established there on the heights south of town. The Confederates really don't make much of an attempt to delay at the lower crossing. So no, nothing really significant there. I think there are some Confederate pickets, but they're driven off relatively easily.
Okay. Let's talk about the night after the crossings and the sacking and the occupation of Fredericksburg. And Tyler, do you want to talk a little bit about that first?
Sure. Yeah. The occupation and the sacking of Fredericksburg. It's a carnival-like atmosphere when the Union Army finally secures the town of Fredericksburg. The Mississippians under Barksdale were lauded for being able to hold the town as long as they have. Now, of course, it didn't ultimately stop the crossing, but the prevention measures they took to delay it really, really played a part into what happens on the 13th. But the Union armies are able to, or the Army of the Potomac, I should call them, they're able to get into Fredericksburg once they clear the Confederates out. And again, we talked about how built up their anger, their frustration with the way this is going. This is not a battle that they've ever experienced before. And now they have an entire city to themselves. So that's going to lead to wanton looting, pillaging, drunkenness, disorderly men just everywhere. Some few incidents to highlight to show you how, like I said, it's a carnival-like atmosphere. There are men that are wearing hoop skirts and running around town with wine bottles. They have found some of the rich folks that live in Fredericksburg. They found their cast of all their wine and their liquors and their beer. You name it. There's food. There's books being thrown into the streets. There's furniture. Someone drags a piano outside and starts playing a piano. There's even a Union soldier reprimanded at the riverbanks for carrying a stuffed alligator and running around town with a stuffed alligator. I mean, that's comical almost to think about. Speaking of comical, some Union troops find in a barrel what they believe is flour. Oh man, they have themselves an opportunity to cook some good food, right? We're gonna have flapjacks tonight, boys. Well, when they cook it, prepare what they believe is about to be a flapjack or whatever they're making. They take one good old bite and find out that they just bit into good old plaster of Paris, man. So like this is like eating concrete, and this is the atmosphere that's happened. And again, this
Ah,
is not really able to be stopped. There's a lot of criticism on the Union High Command here at that they just allowed all these men to enter dwellings and destroy civilian articles like clothes and books and heirlooms. The church, St. George's Episcopal Church downtown, actually has their communion sets stolen. Coincidentally, they have it all back now, but this is this type of atmosphere that's happening here. And again, I really like to think that this is a culmination of the day. This is the fact that men have been, in their minds, murdered by the enemy. This isn't combat. This is just absolute slaughter on a grand scale. And they're frustrated. And what better way to take out your frustration than vandalizing the hell out of a town? That's rightfully yours in your mind. You've earned this right to be in this town. You have taken it. You now have the right to this. And I think that's what's going through the minds of all the Union troops is they're just letting loose. They're kicking their shoes back. They're having a good time. But it's a dark predecessor as to what's to come a day and a half later.
yeah. And Tyler, you remember last year when we sat up at Mary's Heights by the wall on the evening of that night, and I said
Sure.
that I could imagine the hum and the noise and the, you know what I mean. I tried to imagine the noise that
Yeah.
was going on in that town. So I wonder what that was like for the Confederates sitting up in their position.
Oh,
They
it
must
must have
have
been
heard that
infuriating.
noise.
Sure, they have. And, I appreciate you bringing that up too, because Darren, that was one of the most special moments I think we had in our trip was that night before where we were able to go to that and like really just try to understand, from their sake, like you just said, like what it was like to be in Fredericksburg the night before these assaults or that just the bulk of the armies are getting across. So we did it the night of the 12th, which was the night before the assault. So the night that the looting and pillaging is happening is the night of the 11th into the 12th. The
Mhm.
12th is going to predominantly be spent bringing men in.
Yeah.
But even the night of the 12th, can you just imagine the leftovers of what's going on? You can hear all the troops moving into the town. You can hear probably the crackling of fires from buildings. I'm pretty sure a day later that some of these buildings are burning still. I mean, there was a lot of damage and fire in the town of Fredericksburg itself. But it must have just infuriated the Confederates on that side to see and hear Union troops burning and pillaging and looting a southern city. That has to be something that strikes a nerve with them. And I would be wrong to say that they're not preparing to get back at the Union soldiers that are doing this to them.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's move to the 13th of December. And the right Grand Division is going to attack. It's been ordered to attack Mary's Heights. Tim, would you like to explain a little bit more about that?
You want me to explain Burnside's overall plan or just the right Grand Division?
Yeah, go for it. Go for the overall plan. Yeah, and then talk about particularly that side of the
Okay, so
if you wouldn't mind.
Burnside's overall plan is he's gonna he wants to lead with his left, attacking through a city and down the heights. I mean, Mary's Heights is visible, from where he's watching the battle there at Falmouth. His headquarters is elsewhere in Falmouth. But Chatham is Sumner's headquarters, actually. So he can see the heights. So it's rather imposing. But the Confederate left offers more opportunity, more maneuver room for Franklin's left Grand Division, which consists of the First Corps and the Sixth Corps. Correct, Tyler?
That'd be correct.
So First and Sixth Corps are to the south of Fredericksburg. They're going to launch the major assault in Burnside's mind. However, he writes some pretty confusing orders. to Franklin. And you have to understand the military terminology of the time. Today, it sounds pretty clear, right? He directs them to seize Prospect Hill, and basically the crossing at Hamilton's Crossing. So he wants to basically seize Jackson's position. Well, in 19th century military lingo, that is actually a relatively weak term. An aggressive assault, which Burnside has in mind, would typically be issued with the word carry, to carry the position, Prospect Hill and Hamilton's Crossing. So basically Franklin will only attack with one division, sufficient to seize a portion of that line. He isn't supposed to take the whole thing. That's what carry means in 19th century lingo. So the assault on the right, which everyone's more familiar with, been depicted in paintings, Don Troiani's famous painting of the Irish Brigade. That's going to be Edwin V. Sumner's right Grand Division, specifically Darius Couch's Second Army Corps will lead that assault. In addition to the, he'll have the 9th Corps, which is Center Grand Division, but he'll also have elements of the 5th Corps attacking, also attacking on the right. So for right Grand Division, Sumner's going to start early. Most of his men are encamped closer to the river. One of the problems he'll actually have is that so many of the streets run directly east-west. Confederate artillery positions up on Marie's Heights and Willis Hill are perfectly sighted down the streets. So as Union troops form up and move to the east to launch these assaults, they're pretty much under artillery fire from the get-go. So I don't know if you want me to get
talk about the artillery, because it's a massive part of that side of the battlefield, isn't it?
Right. So the position was work was developed primarily. Edward Porter Alexander, one of Longstreet's chief artillerists, and Pendleton, the much maligned Pendleton, who's the chief of artillery for the Army of Northern Virginia, will basically work to develop, Pendleton's responsible for the entire artillery line. Alexander really will focus just on Marie's Heights, but, he's able to put Confederate artillery, which is generally outranged, on higher terrain, which actually helps to extend the range further into town than it would otherwise be. So they're able to cover not only the streets, but everything up to basically to the base of Marie's Heights. And fortunately for the Confederates, they have this ready-made position at the Sunken Road in that sector line, which means that the guns don't have to worry about the typical problem that artillery of the era would have, which is not being able to depress their barrels. They don't need to depress their barrels because they know that there's very little chance that infantry is going anywhere. So basically, they can cover everything that they're supposed to, pretty much right up to that stone wall. Because if the Union gets that, then the artillery needs to go anyway, and the infantry should slow them down long enough for the artillery to get off there. But in that battle, at least, that actually doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, Tyler, if you want to fill anything in. I know artillery in that sector is near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, what I'd like to bring up is the terrain, obviously, because now, obviously, when you go to Fredericksburg, it's urban sprawl. And Tyler, just explain a little bit about the, what it was like before and during the battle, because you also have is it a canal or something they had to cross as well?
Oh, yes, there was a canal. So if we're looking at I'll start with the Marie's Heights sector, as we call it. This portion of the battlefield, Union troops are faced with 900 yards of open ground to cross, with some obstructions along the way. And one of those chief obstructions is going to be a mill race or a canal ditch. This was feeding the canals that are all over Fredericksburg. Quite a few of them actually powered, of course, by the Rappahannock River. There's that darn river again. But the canal ditch that these troops are going to be faced with, 10 feet wide, roughly about 6 feet deep. And at the time of the battle, so this is on the 13th, there's about 3 feet of standing water in the mill race. And the reason that there's only about 3 feet left is there has been an attempt by the Union engineers to drain it. The other problem is the Confederates pulled up all the wooden bridges, all the crossing points you could make by not having to dive into this ditch. And so when they pull that up, the only things left are a few beams and stringers, and it's a pretty serious obstacle. The Confederate artillery know this, and they're going to have specific guns zeroed in on the canal ditch. So when troops are crossing this obstruction, obviously becoming vulnerable, not that they're not vulnerable in 900 yards of open ground, anyways. They're exceptionally vulnerable here, and the Confederates are going to take advantage of this canal ditch and just kind of maximize their effectiveness with their artillery there. But Tim mentioned as soon as the Confederates are able to spot Union troops moving in line, the artillery is readily effective, and it's wiping out troops galore. And the terrain, again, it's 900 yards. This is a fairgrounds. There is also closer to the wall, about 150 to 200 yards away from it, is something known as the swale. The swale, swale itself is a small, gentle depression in the ground. And here, the swale is the last real form of defense for the Union Army, because what's in front of them is a sunken road. Years and years of wagon travel. Picture, if you're from this area, have you ever been on the I-95 corridor, and you know how busy that is, and you know how I wouldn't ever say 95 inconvenient in the same sentence, so let me not say that. But in hindsight, it's a very heavily traveled road. It's a main thoroughfare. This is basically what the Sunken Road was. It was known as the Telegraph Road. It was running through the edge of Fredericksburg, and this is going to be a heavily traveled road, obviously causing the road sort of to become depressed and sunken. So there's where you get the Sunken Road from, just like the wagon ruts at Antietam. And, you know, this is a kind of a common thing when it comes to battlefield. There always seems to be a sunken road somewhere. On that sunken road is a stone wall, part of it becoming a retaining wall when the ground is more sunken and more lower. This retaining wall is holding up the earth that's around the wall, and the other portion of the sunken road and the stone wall, or let's just call it stone wall at this point, was more of a partition. It was a property divider. Families that were living along the Telegraph Road did not necessarily want all that traffic and travel to wander into their front yard. So to have this divider here serves as kind of a barrier between horses veering off and getting into your front yard, or just wanderers, you know, walking in. This is going to serve as a perfect and ideal defensive position for the Confederate forces that are behind the wall. Right behind the wall and behind the road is an eminence known as Marie's Heights and Willis Hill. This is a very, 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 and to me, and when I say those names, the connotations I get and the things that drum up in my head are synonymous with this battle. And it's a horrific place to be. It's a horrific name. And I get that because, again, standing on Marie's Heights, if you ever have the opportunity to do it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You have control of the battlefield in this sector. You put artillery up on that hill and you line infantry on the road beneath it, and you've got quite the impenetrable force there. And now, of course, numbers play a factor in this. If you have the steady stream of fire coming off of that, you're not going to break that. And that is maximizing topography, in my opinion. The Confederates take full advantage of their impregnable position. And I mean, it's just a natural defensive position. It's perfect.
Mm-hmm. And you did bring it up then as well, and I'll bring up the picture of the swale, and that is the actual swale. So
yes,
Tyler,
it is.
tell everyone, because obviously the swale has disappeared, but obviously you showed where you can still see the swale. So if people do visit Fredericksburg, tell them where they can find this swale.
Sure. So there are some sites in Fredericksburg you can actually go to see remnants of the swale, and in some cases, what is the closest representation to what it would have looked like in 62. Mind you, there are houses on any side of it. It is an alleyway in the city, and the city does hold right-of-ways to it, so you are able to visit it if you ever go to Fredericksburg, just for that clarification there. But even today, so you see in the picture there, I went straight to the ground when we got to that position, because I just, in my mind, I was like, I want to see what my visibility would be. How safe am I in this swale? Of course, dimensions aren't necessarily the exact same, but they're pretty darn close compared to some of the roads that have been paved and bulldozed in order for that to happen. And so when I went there with Darren last year, almost a year ago today, actually, we walked to the swale, and I just again I plopped down, and when I went down, one thing I noticed is I had to have my head almost like face in the dirt for me not to see the wall. And if I raise my head just the slightest bit, you can see it. And in my mind, the only thing I'm thinking of is these men that were even laying here that consider this the last form of defense that they had in front of this wall, that you didn't put yourself so low to the ground that you're going to sink beneath it. You're going to get struck by bullets. And we see an account from Private William McCarter of the 116th Pennsylvania Infantry, part of the Irish Brigade, who is wounded during their charge there on Marie's Heights and trying to take those heights. Obviously, they don't. They are going to stop short of the wall, about 100 to 150 yards out. And McCarter takes 2 bullets and drops and is left on the field for, I think, almost 2 days. Now, when he returns to the city of Fredericksburg and is able to find accommodations in a hospital, and of course, when I say a hospital, I mean somebody's house. There isn't Mary Washington Hospital to just run up in and go get treatment. When he's in his house, he shakes one of the blankets that were on his back, and roughly 46 bullets fall out of that blanket. So when you have that many bullets falling out of that blanket, if he didn't have that and he was laying just even the centimeter above ground that he was, we would be talking a different story about William McCarter for sure.
Wow.
And that says a lot about probably what did unfortunately happen to many men that were laying in this swale.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to the opposite side of the battlefield and Slaughter Pen Farm. And this is a great picture taken by myself on the morning of the 13th, with the frost laying on the ground, and it's just amazing place.
What a special moment that was.
It was, and it's a special place. And Tim, you literally live over the road from this amazing location. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about this sector of the battlefield?
So yeah, as you can see in the Slaughter Pen Farm, give a plug to the American Battlefield Trust and its members. This was the largest private battlefield acquisition in American history to save this site, which was going to be developed into an industrial park. So if it weren't for the trust and its membership, this would be nothing but buildings. It would be ruined, just like much of the rest of the Fredericksburg site. And so what you see here, this is basically taken, if I'm not mistaken, from roughly the railroad location, or is that the railroad?
I think it's more sort of like near the entrance area, where the parking lot is.
Okay, well, yeah, hard to tell. Sorry.
So we walked out a little bit, actually, I think, if I remember rightly.
So as you can see here, the terrain is open. There's currently one farmhouse, but that's post-war and probably won't survive for very long. There were no buildings on the location there at the time. I mean, there were a couple cabins off to the south for the slaves from the Mansfield plantation. But by and large, it was open terrain. But it's deceptive because it actually rolls. So if you go there, you can actually, troops can be hidden in folds in the ground. But the big deal from the Union perspective was it allowed maneuverability, and it controlled acts. The Confederates were positioned on the heights to the south of Fredericksburg, were able to control basically what was known as the old Richmond Road. They got confused. Union troops got confused about the names. The maps really botched the road names, but basically Confederates controlled the roads to Bowling Green, to Richmond, and the railroad that ran to south to Richmond. So what happened was William Franklin, I kind of mentioned this earlier, basically he takes a very conservative view of Burnside's orders. Burnside wanted an aggressive attack, yet Franklin launches one division. So it's one division of the First Corps under General George Gordon Meade, with another division in support under John Gibbon, who had recently just recently been promoted to division command. He had previously been commander of the First Corps' arguably most proficient, famous combat unit, which was the Iron Brigade. And the Iron Brigades could be in the sector. It's could be a little bit to the south of Sarpen Farm, basically protecting the flank. Meade will get prepared. Now, one interesting thing that's worth mentioning is the temperature. So if everyone's watched our favorite movie, Gods and Generals, there's a little bit of sarcasm there. All these Union soldiers will be shivering. There'll be overcoats. Well, in reality, the temperature was about 36 degrees that morning, but it very quickly rose to over 60. So instead of frost turned to mud. And that's going to play a role. So Meade will move to the south. He's actually a little at the southern end of the Sarpen Farm and further south of that, heading towards Prospect Hill across the RF&P Railroad to Jackson's line. There's actually a hole in that part of line, which was held by A.P. Hill's division. Lee knew about it. He had planned artillery to cover it, but to be honest, that actually didn't work out as well. But initially, it isn't infantry or that massed artillery that obstructs Meade. It's one lone gun led by a guy named John Pelham. There you go.
That's right.
Who basically moves just to the east of Hamilton's Crossing with two guns. Initially has a Napoleon and then a Blakely rifle. The Blakely will be destroyed by damaged by counter battery fire. But Pelham, with this one gun, basically brings to a halt this whole Union offensive, basically corps level offensive. Firing into Meade's flank. They're confused. Where is this coming from? Other Confederate guns up on the heights open up. Union artillery is rolled up into position. However, if you look at Sarpen Farm, then and now it's farm fields. And as I mentioned, the frost has thawed, turning the fields to mud. So the guns will basically get stuck in this glue-like mud, and their axles will begin to break, and their trails on the back of the guns will begin to break because, unlike today, they're not, synthetic. And then you have issues where the Corps commander, John Reynolds, who is commissioned as an artillery officer, he's less concerned about the infantry providing support. He does send the Iron Brigade to that flank to deal with Pelham. But he then decides that he's going to play a battery commander and is going to assist aiming Union batteries to engage Confederate guns off to the west on the heights. Finally, they silence guns. Meade moves out, comes under fire again, stops, then finally moves out for good, and he hits that gap in the Confederate line. Very swampy ground. Don't go there. It's chock full of snakes. But that's just my own opinion. He's able to secure a breakthrough with his division, which is made up of Pennsylvania Reserves, as they're called. Originally 10,000 strong. These were men that exceeded the Pennsylvania quota, so they were labeled the Reserve Division. The original reserves numbered about 3,800 at this point. They had received 2 new regiments, basically increasing their strength by an additional 1,000, though the veterans really don't trust these new troops. But together, the reserves, which had fought really well on the peninsula, they're at Beaver Dam Creek, Gaines's Mill, fought in the cornfield at Antietam, they puncture a Confederate line here. However, Meade doesn't get the support he needs. Gibbon's there fighting hard to the north, but he sends back for reinforcements. They try to get David Bell Birney's brigade of the 3rd Corps to come up. He won't. So eventually Meade is basically pushed back. Confederates are able to, A.P. Hill is able to organize counterattacks, despite the confusion caused in his ranks, from the breakthrough, and he lost a brigade commander. Brigadier General Maxey Gregg, a South Carolinian, who's basically deaf and doesn't hear the Union troops that are right next to him, and they mortally wound him. But the Confederates are basically able to go and push Meade back. And I'll actually turn it over to Tyler because he knows quite a bit about the Confederate and Union fight here on Slaughter Pen Farm and the valor that was displayed here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we're talking about Slaughter Pen, there's some Medal of Honors that are, some serious Medal of Honors. We're looking at 5 that are awarded in this thing. Not that any Medal of Honor is less significant, but to have 5 awarded in one spot is pretty crazy. I don't know the necessities on all 5 at Slaughter Pen, but I know of a few. But there's some acts that don't go with the Medal of Honor that I think should. One of those being the German immigrant in the Union Army during one of the assaults against the railroad there against the North Carolinians. There is this gentleman who is overly enthusiastic about leading his men into battle by being a color bearer, to where his men stop and he continues to run forward towards the Confederate line, and of course is ultimately shot down. But he is trying to inspire his troops and move forward. But the culmination of this whole battle really takes place, like Tim says, with Meade. Meade's going to break through Confederate lines, that gap that Maxcy Gregg leaves wide open. Darren and I have walked right along the swampy areas by the railroad and have seen how it could be deemed militarily insurpassable. We're talking about George Gordon Meade here. George Gordon Meade isn't ruling anything out. Sends those troops across the swamp, and there's a gap in the lines. Again, Maxcy Gregg's men are not necessarily covering the swamp, so that's leaving this really noticeable gap in the lines. So Meade breaks through, and Meade goes all the way up the hills and scatters Confederates all over the place. And Jackson is now needing to regain control of the line he's holding. When he does this, he's going to launch what we call the Twilight Assault. Jackson's going to launch a counterattack against Meade. Meade has some issues. There are 0 reinforcements coming to get Meade out of trouble. Because Meade does break through. Initially, there is some success against the Confederates there that are now fleeing because they have been surprised. Maxcy Gregg himself is actually shot and killed. When you have blue uniforms bogged down in mud and swampy waters, you almost look like a gray uniform. And of course, this is a militarily insurpassable obstacle. And Maxcy Gregg is shocked when he gets right up close to the Union troops and finds that his spine has been severed by a mini ball and will later die, becoming mortally wounded because of this shortcoming that he has at Fredericksburg. So back to the issues that Meade's facing. Meade's not able to get reinforcements, and I think a lot of that does stem from the fact that nobody believes that Meade is able to give a command. I don't even think Meade's commanding anybody to do this. He's begging for reinforcements because he knows that he has the initiative here, but the likes of which of Bell Birney will not let him get the reinforcements by not committing his troops to Meade's assault. So ultimately, Meade's assault fails after breaking through because of the Confederate onslaught that now meets Meade and pushes them back to pretty much square one. They're not going to make any more breakthroughs after this.
Mm-hmm. And if he did have the support, do you think they could have the Battle of Fredericksburg been a different story?
It could have. And again, this is just the big what if here. I do believe that this would have been the deciding factor of Fredericksburg. You're not really necessarily getting a deciding factor at Marye's Heights. Marye's Heights isn't seeing any Union success. The only breakthrough that is very, very significant that does take place is here on the area of Slaughter Pen Farm against Prospect Hill. Meade is able to score that breakthrough, but the follow-up wasn't there. There just wasn't any support, and I think if he had that support and had he have had the lines behind him, Birney committing his troops too, yeah, we may have seen some Union success, and the Battle of Fredericksburg could have ended very differently.
Yeah. And I just want to point out, ladies and gentlemen, if you do ever visit Fredericksburg, please visit Slaughter Pen Farm. It's an amazing place to walk. Yeah, amazing. And Prospect Hill as well. You know, that was amazing as well. And
we were talking terrain too.
Mm-hmm.
The terrain of Slaughter Pen Farm there, and you saw it firsthand.
I mean,
when you start walking that thing.
When you see it in person, it's just mind-boggling. It really is.
It makes a lot of sense as to why the maneuvers were what they were.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense as to why Union troops were having difficulties assaulting.
But then all of a sudden you walk out and you've got a ditch in front of you as well. You know, there's
Virginia ditch fence. That's right.
You know, and it's like, how did these guys get across this field? You know, so I'm so so pleased that American Battlefield Trust managed to save this land, because
As am I. What a
that
great
would have been
organization they are for
devastating if
that.
they'd have built industrial units on that land. Oh my God, it doesn't bear thinking about. Okay, one thing I want to bring up is in Gods and Generals, the movie, you see a scene where Robert E. Lee is nearly wiped out by a cannon. Did that
Yes.
actually happen? Tell me about that.
Yes, it did. There was a burst barrel on top of Telegraph Hill, so around right where this gun was probably sitting
Mhm.
today. And it's not the same gun, obviously, but one that was very similar. Um, Unfortunately, things like this happen in the Civil War. Barrels become fouled and will burst. And this is what happens on Telegraph Hill, and it does obviously kill the men around it that are manning the gun. And when the gun does burst, it drops Lee to the ground and the men standing with him. But uh, fortunately for Lee, it wasn't his time as the movie claims, and he's
Mhm.
not killed by that blast. But it
Yeah.
does almost take out some of the seriously high-ranking Confederate officials.
Wow. Yeah. And again, that's
That could have been
another
a
amazing
very bad
place to
day.
visit. Hmm.
It is an incredibly amazing place.
Yeah. Really. And it was really strange about it. Right behind it is an industrial area.
Yep.
It's really strange.
Somebody's house is right on Telegraph Hill too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg, because it's never really spoken about. These two armies, literally obliterate each other, or well, the Union Army gets obliterated. What happens afterwards to these guys?
Oh man, so they're stuck. I'm gonna just do a little quick quote, and then I want Tim to finish the rest for me. But I have an ancestor that served in Fredericksburg on the Confederate side and was wounded at Antietam, so he wasn't in combat, but was actually running orders for Lee and Jackson on that front. His name is Edward Samuel Duffy. We've talked a lot about Parker's Battery before. It's where this gentleman's from. But the reason I bring him up is because he writes about seeing the aftermath himself, and he writes that there are a bunch of naked corpses on the plain because the Confederates have taken clothing and have it's winter, so obviously clothing is scarce, and the more warm you can get, the better. So they're not going to be needing it, and the Confederates take it. So he writes about this, and this is just in front of the Maurice Heights sector. But one real quick story, the and Tim, if you want to tell this one, I can back off and let you do it. But I want to talk about Richard Kirkland for a minute. So,
Go for it.
all right, so at the end of the Battle of Fredericksburg on the 13th, as the fighting starts to wane and the sun starts to go down and the cold really does set in, and I think the realization sets in as to what just happened. Not everybody is immune to what just happened. Chief among them is Richard Kirkland. Richard Kirkland is in the 23rd or 2nd South Carolina, excuse me. He's a 21-year-old. And what he's hearing across that wall is the whimpers, the cries, the screams, the begs for water. And Kirkland can only bear it but so long. And he will grab as many canteens as humanly possible and seek permission to scale the wall and aid his enemy. Initially, his commander, Joseph B. Kershaw, will say, no, this is not acceptable. I can't authorize this under a flag of truce, but if you want to take it upon yourself to do this, to do so. And so he does. He jumps over the wall. He goes to the first Union soldier closest to him, and he grabs his head and he cradles his arm and he pours water in his mouth and gives him that drink that he so desperately needs. And he does this to many Union soldiers laying in the field. He'll go to the next and do the same thing, give them the water that they're begging for, give them that little bit of ease. And it's seen by both sides. He's not shot at by Union soldiers. I'm sure initially they probably thought he's scaling the wall to finish the job, but he doesn't. He stops and shows this act of compassion and humanity. Now, to caveat that, is Richard Kirkland the one face that does this? I don't think so. I've read a lot of accounts of somebody saying a woman that looked starkly man-like, if you will, with just the gait of a man, the build of one in a dress to aid the Union soldiers there. There's some talk of some Georgians who've climbed the wall and done the same thing. So if Kirkland really does this act, I think he's more so the poster child of what happens at Fredericksburg. I think many soldiers did this. I don't think it was just limited to Richard Kirkland, but I think that he was the one that was most noticeable for it, and therefore is the face of the act that takes place at Fredericksburg after the battle.
Yeah. And what is the morale of the Army of the Potomac after this massive defeat? And of course, obviously, President Lincoln, I mean, really, they pushed for this, didn't they, and what they get is not what they wanted. And it's going to go on for a bit longer, isn't it? The pain and the suffering.
Well, they did. I mean, from Burnside's perspective, his morale's hurt. On the 14th, he's devastated. He thinks he's going to continue the assault. His subordinates finally prevail on him to resist that urge, and they do withdraw on the 15th. The Confederates are ebullient but raging. There's a story, Shelby Foote talks about it in his book, and then in Ken Burns' Civil War, Jackson goes into town and said, someone says, well, looks at all the devastation caused by the Union troops. What are we going to do about all this? And Jackson responds, kill them all. Mm-hmm. But Union morale is already kind of hurting at this point. So many of the volunteers that fought for a war, thought they were enlisting for a war for Union are not pleased with the changing direction of the war with the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. I'm not passing judgment. That's the reality. Union soldiers, many of them, some were enthusiastic about it, some were ambivalent about it, some were downright upset about it. Enlistments are going to be coming to an end that summer. Many are like, I'll, be darned if I'm going to enlist again. And then, yes, Burnside feels pressure to reinstitute, to restart operations as soon as he can. So, late winter, early spring, he begins an attempt to try to move around Lee's left in what becomes known as the Mud March. They don't make it into his objective. They don't even cross the Rappahannock. They get bogged down. Union morale suffers further. They call that I took you there, Darren, to one of the winter camps. The Union, in the heels of Fredericksburg, they go into this winter camp. It's a pretty severe winter. Here in Virginia, people think winter, they think December, but really it's January, February is the worst months. That's what hits. They call it the Union's Valley Forge. Burnside is then relieved, and he's replaced by Joe Hooker, who reorganizes the army, does away with grand division concept, reforms the artillery, probably for worse, reforms the cavalry, definitely for better, and then he moves on to his attempt to deal with Robert E. Lee. Mm-hmm.
And I will say, ladies and gentlemen, me and Tyler did sit down last year and talk about the Mud March, which is a podcast. So if you go to the American Civil War and UK History podcast or channel, you'll be able to watch that. And also everything that me and Tyler filmed last year is also available on the YouTube channel. Also, me and Tim did a little film on the Middle Crossing in August, which is going to be available during that 3-day period over the anniversary. So if you are listening to this beforehand, and go and have a look. All that's left to say is thank you, Tyler. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, man. It was awesome.
And I love discussing this battle. It's one of my favourite battles. And one of the reasons it's one of my favourites is because I've had two of the best guides and two of the best friends to show me and even explore this battlefield with, So thank you very much.
That means a lot, Darren. I enjoyed every bit of the times we spent on these battlefields.
Yeah, this is a special place.
We have a lot of good times here.
Definitely, and I appreciate you guys putting yourselves out to show me this amazing place.
Well, we can't appreciate you enough for coming from such a very long way to visit us.
Yeah.
Yeah, you came from afar, man. It's not just, right down the road.
Time. But yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. See you all soon. Cheers.